Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining. We will get started shortly. In the meantime, please let us know who you are and where you're from in the chat box. And let us know why you joined this last session today. Today is part 3 of our 3-part webinar series on aging and IDD, family future planning. So we'll get started shortly, but as people trickle in, just drop your name in the chat box and let us know where you're from and why you've joined today. All righty. Okay, so we'll get started with some overview information and then we'll jump in. So my name is Morgan Bradley and I am the Community Outreach Program Manager and Regional Coordinator with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service in partnership with the Texas Council for Developmental Disabilities. And I am joined today with my colleagues from across the state. And before we start, I'll quickly go through an overview of the discussion today, and I'll provide a few Zoom tips and go over our collaborative effort and ways you can connect with us, and then a few announcements. So during today's session, all attendees' cameras and microphones are off. However, to communicate with the presenter or with any of my colleagues for any technical assistance, please let us know in the chat box if you need any help, and we will be able to help you that way. All right. Okay. So the Texas Council for Developmental Disabilities, or TCDD, is a statewide governor-appointed board that is the only entity in state government solely focused on the needs and interests of individuals with developmental disabilities and their families. TCDD is mandated to provide input on state policy initiatives, build communities through statewide grant projects, and educate and inform the public and leaders on developmental disability issues. And for more information about TCDD, please visit the link that was dropped in the chat. And Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service is the outreach and community education arm of the Texas A&M system. For its more than 100-year history, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension has worked to help Texans better their lives with practical, applicable learning through a statewide network of professional educators, trained volunteers, a presence in all 254 counties, and the campuses of Texas A&M University and Prairie View A&M University. And for more information about AgriLife Extension, please visit the link that was dropped in the chat. And TCDD has continued its partnership with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service over the past 3 years. And there are regional coordinators located throughout the state. There are 6 of us. And if you would like to connect with your regional coordinator, you can through visiting the link that was dropped in the chat as well. And we'll share more information about what we do later. And so, as I stated earlier, today is part 3 of our 3-part series. If you've been with us all month, thank you so much for being along the ride with us. It has been a lot of really great information shared by Dr. Heller and her colleague, Dr. Arnold. But our presenter today is Dr. Heller, who will continue the conversation. And Dr. Heller, I'm so sorry. Is of the University of Illinois at Chicago, and it's University Center of Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. Dr. Heller is a distinguished professor, and she heads the Department of Disability and Human Development at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and its University Center of Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. Dr. Heller has also directed the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Developmental Disabilities and Health and the Family Support Research and Training Center. Her research focuses on health and long-term services and supports for individuals with disabilities and their families. She serves on the Executive Council Publication Committee and is Vice President of the Americas for the International Association for the Scientific Study of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. Dr. Heller is also the co-founder of the National Sibling Leadership Network. Dr. Heller has done amazing work over the years, and it has been a pleasure to have her be a part of this series and a pleasure to have her talk today. And so, Dr. Heller, we will turn it over to you to begin the presentation for today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me in this series on future planning. This is a topic that's dear to my heart, both a personal interest. I'm also, I would say, aging, and my sister is aging. I have a sister with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and we've been engaged with a lot of these issues. I've spent most of my career thinking about how to bridge aging and disability in the work that I do. So today I'm going to talk about engaging with aging in the future planning process. And, as we're doing this future planning, we're thinking about when the caregiver gets older and when the person with disability gets older. So I want to give a little perspective about aging and how we think about aging. I'm not going to go into great detail about all the things that happen with aging. I know there were some earlier series about aging, but I will try to give some context, because as we do planning, we need to think about both about the person who's aging and the family and the context that they live in. So let me give a little bit of a historical perspective about how we've thought about aging and services for aging. I think this is important to think about in the planning, because people will have a different perspective, especially some older caregivers. So we used to think, the next slide. Next slide, please. Oops, okay. We used to think about, if we're going to do aging services, then we used to have sheltered workshops, and we'd say, oh, this corner, we're going to do some aging stuff with the older people, kind of that more segregated model. And then we said, that's not, we need to think about age appropriate. So then people were sent to senior centers, of course, in a group. Well, a lot of senior centers didn't like having this whole group of people with IDD suddenly coming there. So, then there was about how to do that in a good way. So we developed person-centered planning for later life. And I will talk about some of the work we've done in that area, which much of our work later stemmed out of a curriculum that we developed on person-centered planning for later life. But we know that person-centered planning pretty much since the 1990s has been a way that we think about how to plan more individualistic. And then we really started thinking about being part of the community being so important, and human rights. With the human rights work of the United Nations, very important in terms of thinking about the rights of people with disabilities. And now we've got the Medicaid home and community-based services final rule about looking for more inclusive kinds of services. So this is a historical perspective, both for our field and both for how we think about aging. Next slide. So what is successful aging? This is really interesting to think about, because often we say it's aging without a disability. If you look at a lot of the definitions, which, we call that ableism, because what about people who've had a long-term disability? What does that mean? And why is that successful or not successful? And then we have a whole thing about staying youthful, and the whole idea about ageism, which we all know so much about. And one of my former students made this term compulsory youthfulness. And it's kind of the intersection between ableism and ageism, and with disability studies. And we think of people who are older and become disabled as failures. Somehow it's diminished worth. But we know that it doesn't just depend on somebody's health behaviors. There's so many other things that go and that get involved in that, like poverty and not having access to appropriate health care. So, what is the state's responsibility and all that? This is important to keep in mind in the planning process. Next slide. So how do we actually understand aging? So we have to think about how people with disability feel about aging themselves. Sort of do they have an identity as a person with disability? Sometimes people get older and they develop disabilities and they still won't say that they're disabled. And that whole concept of interdependent versus independent, you know, in the IDD field, we've so much talked about independence being so important, but we're all interdependent. And there's nothing wrong with being interdependent. We all need support and we all support each other. So we need to take into account minority status, poverty, culture, all those things, and think in terms of a life course approach. So if we think about aging, we're really thinking throughout the life course. Next slide. So what does aging well mean? It often means living on your own terms. You know, we say that people become more and more like themselves and more different from others as they get older. So if you're stubborn, you're going to be more stubborn. And if you like being around people, then you're even more going to want to be around people. We want to add value to society, to family or friends. And we're seeing so much in the literature now about the importance of people who keep active with friends and their community, how they live longer and in better health. And then maintaining health and function, of course, that's usually the first thing we think about in aging well. Next slide. Just very briefly, I just want to mention that we know that life expectancy can be quite similar for people with IDD, unless they have severe levels of cognitive impairment, Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, multiple disabilities. So I just wanted to have the context of what happens to people. Next slide. Here's some examples from interviews that we've done of what it means to grow older. It means you're settled and know what you're doing. I am more kinder. I get along a lot better. I have friends I'm happy with and that I do things with. For the future, I wish that I keep going happy and that I don't feel old and that I'm not in a wheelchair. Next slide. This gentleman said, I feel people 50 years and older have the same chances as younger people have and more, especially people with disabilities. Finally, I feel older people with disabilities shouldn't let their age or disability stop them from getting the job of their dreams or having fun. Next slide. So this is a slide I showed before when we talked about future planning. And I think it's important to keep in mind the development of chronic health conditions. And this is both for the caregiver and for the person with disability who may develop chronic health conditions earlier. Changes in family caregiving and supports. We talked more about family caregiving in our first webinar of this series. Retiring from employment, and what does that mean for this group? And what about receiving end-of-life care? So next slide. So we developed a curriculum called Person-Centered Planning for Later Life and did a lot of research on it. And this was actually done in the early 90s. And we did a recent version of it called Engaging with Aging, Person-Centered Planning for Later Life. And some of what we have, and many of our other training curricula that we've developed since then really grew out of this and thinking about this. And the notion that you need to understand aging if you're doing some planning. So we use a life story line to help people kind of understand what it means, because some people with IDD don't really understand what it means to get older. I did some interviews and one gentleman said, means you're dead, means you end up in a nursing home. They really didn't understand. And so it's important to have them think about it in a pictorial way that they can understand. The rights and choice making is really important. And how do you do that? How do you balance person-centered and family-centered? And thinking about the rights of people and example is if they live in for example, in a group home, how do they deal with the other people in the home or with their support people? Of course, taking care of the health, and there's always a big emphasis on that. And where they live, sometimes, or how to change where they're living, you know, who in the family will take care. You heard something about nuts and bolts last time from Katie, from Dr. Arnold. And developing the friendships and community supports is obviously in that. The work, volunteering, and free time is again important. And some people want to continue working. End of life planning, and then the whole thing of review and goal setting. Next. Okay. So just some key aspects as we develop this is, we want to increase the understanding of aging and context. And sometimes that's good when you start the planning to think about that. Some people get very anxious thinking about getting older and what does that mean. The whole notion of choice making and self-determination in the context of the support systems and what's out there and what people are able to do and to really make those opportunities happen. Because sometimes the options aren't really there. So you want an awareness of potential activities and actions. I did a bunch of interviews in nursing homes, and actually I think there was a whole thing in Texas about this, because I was asked to work on something related to Texas and some choice making. And I did this, when I did this in Illinois and asked people if they wanted to move out of the nursing home, half the people said no, but they didn't know about anything else. So they had to learn about other things. Once they did or got a chance to visit, they had some different opinions about what they wanted. So if you ask people what they want, you may not, if they don't really know any possibilities, they're not going to be able to be very helpful. Or given choices, of which 2 different choices and neither one is really what they want. So it's really using the problem solving and action planning. And this was really a precursor to the future is now that we developed, that we've talked about before. Next. Very briefly about the health of people with IDD, which if you heard the earlier sessions, that, for example, people with Down syndrome get Alzheimer's earlier than other people. Many people with IDD get osteoporosis based often because of the medicines that they take for epilepsy, or because they're they don't have mobility. Oral health is often very poor and is related to people's health, and higher rates of diabetes, higher rates of falls, especially for people who have an unsteady walking or are on lots of meds. Next slide. We know there's more obesity, that more sedentary behavior. You see the couch potato picture I have, often unhealthy diets, and it's all related to their quality of life. Next slide. When we talk about access to healthcare, we know there's a diagnosis of cancer at a later stage. There's a lot of polypharmacy, where people are often taking as many as 13 different, and certainly as you get older, you take more and more of these. And they have found that they're more likely to have deaths that are amenable to healthcare intervention. And I found a recent study, I just heard that's even more true for women with IDD. And lack of testing and treatment for COVID-19, I think we can skip that. This is in general, not just for aging. So let's go to the next slide. So what about strategies to reduce disparities? Because that's really what we want to talk about. And I did want to give some context about that. Well, greater knowledge about the impairment and treatment, certainly education is a big thing. Reduction in poverty and unhealthy environments. So, looking at that, and this is where we really need to look at the broader context in terms of what we can do with that. Improved health behaviors to help literacy and health promotion. That's something that we can certainly target. And improved access, accessibility, equity, and effectiveness of healthcare is all important and will lead to better health and fitness in later life. Next slide. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some curriculum, particularly the first one, because that's the one that we developed, and it's called Health Matters, Exercise, Nutrition, and Health Education Curriculum for People with DD. There are other curriculums like Living Well with a Disability, that's out of the University of Montana, And then We Walk, for example, is another one of the ones that we have. So I'll just give you some examples. And these are important, especially the Health Matters was really tested with older adults with IDD. Next. This slide just shows you how we started out by doing it in person at the university, and then we went to train the trainer, and now we have wide reach, including virtual versions of all this. And we've done it in probably Texas as well, and in almost every state and in many places with many certified trainers. Next slide. So these are the curriculums, and there's these are books. One is the actual curriculum, and the second is the train the trainer one about how to set it up in agencies. And now we've developed what's called the Virtual Future is Now, which is totally virtual. And so we do the training virtually, and then the curriculum itself is virtual, and people are able to use it that way. Next slide. This just shows you how we go about doing this. And it's using a stages of behavior change model. And I love it. In the beginning, I'm thinking about it. That's what you call contemplation. I'm making plans, preparation, action, I'm doing it. Maintenance, I'm still doing it. So as you see, and then there can be relapse. This applies to any of us who want to do behavior change of any kind. And it's a useful model of thinking. You may notice that all the pictures are of a man with Down syndrome. That's because the very first project we did was all people with Down syndrome that were age 30 and over. Next slide. Some pictures are the fitness classes that we had, but you don't have to do it this way with all kinds of fancy equipment. Next one. The actual curriculum is a 1 hour of health education classes, 3 days a week. We have 36 classes in there with personal notebooks. It's very much geared and with the language and everything for people with IDD. Next. So the purpose is to understand their attitudes, because we know that attitudes to health, exercise, and food makes a big difference. And finding the kinds of things that they like to do. So, that's the most important. What's fun for people? What kind of music do they like with it? How do they like to exercise? And to gain skills and knowledge about it. And of course, we know that knowing knowledge is not enough. People need support, and they support each other in the class, and they identify places in the community that they can do it. There's many barriers, such as money and transportation and all those things. So it's important to think about that. Next slide. Here's an example of trying to show people the difference between good pain and bad pain. So an example of some of the pictures that we have. Next one. So before we started the program, at least we got people who were past pre-contemplation because they agreed to be in the program. But over 2/3 of these adults with IDD reported receiving little support for exercise. They lacked confidence to do it, little knowledge or motivation. And often, especially this was with the adults with Down syndrome, they had low strength and energy. And so this was the beginning of the program. Next. After the program, the 12-week program, their knowledge about exercise improved, their confidence improved, life satisfaction improved, which is interesting. And then lots of physical measures that we took, like physical activity, strength, energy, peak VO2, and stair. This is aerobic capacity is peak VO2, and stair climbing. And also the caregivers changed their perception of the exercise benefits, and the access barriers were reduced because we came up with ways that they could continue to do that. We also trained their caregivers. Next. Here's an example of circuit program. And here you don't need a bunch of fancy kinds of machines. So if you see here, you can do something like this where you do very short time at each thing, and you can do it at home too. Next. So how do you support people to do exercise? So for example, staff family members can support by giving encouragement, doing some exercise together. I will show you a walking program where the caregivers exercise together. Planning for various kinds of recreational outings. The transportation, the money is often a big part, and often has to be someone going with them. Next. I think nutrition sometimes is more of a challenge, but staff and family very much control that. And they can encourage healthy food choices, can also be the food that's there, assist in developing the plans and goals for changing their eating habits, and offer fruits and vegetables as a snack. This is often a challenge, and people will often say, well, how do you balance this with choice? And, for example, with my sister, one time we were, and she is quite overweight and has pretty severe diabetes. And she was out with her friend, and I saw her in the mall, and I saw her with this huge ice cream sundae and about 4 Cokes in her bag. And I pulled them out, and she started screaming at me, don't you ever do this, which of course I learned not to do that anymore. But then she had someone who really encouraged her to eat healthy. It was a direct support professional. And after that, she lost about 50 pounds, and she was so proud of what she had done. But she was working together with her. So there are ways to support it. Next slide. So you want sustainable health promotion programs. So that's part of the planning, is how do you do it so you have a supportive environment, something that can be continued on. And again, this has to do with supportive attitudes among staff and families. Next. This was the Train the Trainer, where we use peers as co-trainers. We developed this with Special Olympics. Just very quickly, next slide. And this is 12 sessions with about 10 people. We have booklets and wristbands, etc. The next one. And the reason we use peer coaches is because first of all, the coaches themselves end up improving, and people are about the same age and common interests. And so it's a really great way to help them share the health messages. Just as we use peer coaches with the future planning, because it can often be a way that they can share some of their issues better. Next. So some of the outcomes is they learn the knowledge, the mentors increase their confidence to teach the program, increase physical activity, social support for engaging in physical activity, improve physical activity and hydration. So I think it's just, I'm giving some hints of how to include health promotion in agencies' missions, visions, and job descriptions, how to help families think about also, and people with disabilities to think about their own health and how to improve it. Next slide. And here is the We Walk program. And this is a program where the caregiver walks with the person with disability. And it uses technology as part of the intervention. But it's a wonderful way to have them exercise together. Next slide. I'm going to skip the next couple because I want to get to the next part. A few things about the key issues in healthcare. As people get older, there is some rationing that happens, as we saw with the COVID, what was going on. Think about organ transplants or dialysis, and what are some of the criteria? So, for example, years of life expectancy. If you know that say people with Down syndrome may have a shorter lifespan, and the person is 50 years old, will you do an organ transplant or not? These are issues which I don't have answers to, but I'm bringing up the issues. and ability to keep a regimen, would they be able to? And how much support is available? So if there are parents or sisters or brothers around that can help, and will these interventions improve the quality of life, balance with burden for person and carers? So this is just some issues to think about as you think about people getting older. Next. Health checks and preventive screening. So again, you have risk versus benefits and equality of access. We know that often if they do a full geriatric assessment, they're going to find all kinds of things, like, for example, that the hearing they may have age-related issues happening earlier than for other people. So it could be with hearing or with vision, and they may not be able to communicate. So we need health literacy education, time for listening, and care involvement is very important. I can tell you a story about a woman in a nursing home where I was asked to consult on this. And this woman was living with her mother. This was an adult about 50 years old with Down syndrome. And the mother broke her leg and couldn't take care of her for a while and put her in a nursing home, hoping it would be temporary. And what happened, the nursing home thought she was too heavy, put her on a diet. She developed pica, started eating everything in sight. Eventually she died. And the people in this nursing home didn't really know how to work with people with IDD. And in fact, one person said, it was a psychologist who said, maybe we should do behavioral stuff with her. And then someone else said, that doesn't work for these people, which is ridiculous. And there was actually a geriatrician from an Ivy League school who was on the other side with the lawyers saying this woman got perfectly wonderful treatment. So that was kind of shocking to me. Next slide. So this is from interviews of people about what good healthcare is. And getting needs met through access to quality services. Of course, I was able to receive a good psychiatrist, one that has been really helpful to me, and I was able to get my glasses. Humanizing treatment is really important for people. The doctors have been listening and they find the better solution. So it's good to find the doctors that will be able to help the person. Next. And skilled, knowledgeable, and experienced providers. My doctor tells me to take my pills every day and sees how I'm doing. Accessible communication. My doctors take care of me good. I understand when they talk to me. Next one. So here's some barriers, and probably you've heard of some of these. Doctors who did not demonstrate respect for them. This came out a lot in the interviews we did. I'm unhappy with my doctor. If he's the only one there, I won't go. I know that's bad for my health, but he's very rude and makes me feel stupid. I know my body and I know if something is wrong with me, and he thinks he's better and smarter than I am, and we bump heads. And then delays in getting services, well, that's gotten worse these days, of course. I needed a personal assistant and it took a long time, had to have family members help, and they didn't always know what to do. And I've been hearing real horror stories about emergency rooms and how long it takes for everybody. Next slide. Other factors, family involvement is really important. So input in healthcare decisions. So I know you talked last time about supported decision-making, and that becomes very important. And we have actually data where we showed the importance of that. And also the care coordination is really important and how it's done. In many states, managed care has come in, and sometimes the care coordination, care coordinators don't know that much about IDD. Next slide. Here's an example of what's called My Health Passport. Being able to go to a provider and right away have some data that they have right away about the person. And I think this is really important to have. This one comes out of the University of North Florida. Next one, of South Florida. This is a documentary called None of Us Want to Stand Still. Actually, my sister is in that Rush University developed along with Georgetown. And if you get a chance to listen to it, and it's advocates talking about their health and what's good health care for them. Next one. So what about living arrangements? In terms of living arrangements, we know there's the aging of the caregivers. There's changes in the family situation. So maybe one of the parents dies or both parents die or someone moves out of the house that had been helping. So those are real issues. I've heard about stories where the mom goes into a nursing home along with the son or daughter who also has aging health issues. And then sometimes there's not great options in the community. I had an employee working for me who had a son with Down syndrome, and she used to get angry and say, well, we're making people do future planning and the options are horrible out there. Well, part of it is trying to develop, advocacy and helping people think about options and maybe getting together with other families. And then look at the roles after placement. So, I have a sister living in a group home and I go visit her all the time. I'm very involved with what she does, and I know it makes a big difference for her life. Next. This is some statistics from Texas that I saw about where people live. So I thought you might just want to see that. Still, a lot of people live with their families or in host or foster homes. These are people that are in the long-term supports and services system. And then people are living in 16 plus. Texas, like Illinois, has a lot of big ones. Next one. Moving on to employment and retirement. So we know that people with IDD are very much underemployed, particularly in integrated settings. And I looked in Texas, and only 6% were an integrated paid job. I would take out the 15% was from the NCI for the US. So ignore that 15%. But 6%, this is from actual data from the National Survey of State IDD Agencies, Employment and Day Services. And I believe that 2008 is the last one, but actually at one point it was up to 11% in Texas, but the latest data that I saw was 6%. And then 94% were in facility-based non-work. From the National Core Indicators, the NCI, the most recent, 50%, this is nationally, 50% would like a job but don't have one, and 17% do not want a job since they are already retired. So you know that people still want jobs, and many are doing non-work, mostly in facility-based and non-work settings. But people are doing various retirement options like volunteering, recreational and health promotion activities, senior center participation, and continuing education. So these are all things that people can do as they're retired. Next slide. Here's an example of a program called Transition to Retirement, and it comes out of Australia from Roger Stancliffe has been involved in this. He's also working with the University of Minnesota now. And this is where they had mentors that were older people who volunteered, and they were teamed up with people with IDD. And then they came up with what kinds of activities do people want to do? So some wanted to work with a garden club, or they wanted to go to a senior center, or they wanted to volunteer at the zoo, whatever was that they wanted. They worked on that, and they tried to match people up who had some common interests. And it's a really cool, they have a curriculum, and they train the mentors, and they have ongoing support. So this is kind of cool to look at as one way. These were people who were in day programs that they transitioned to retirement. They started 1 day a week, and then it went to more days a week. Next slide. When we think of end-of-life issues, we know there's often an under-recognition of health issues. And we don't always know when people are in pain. And so, that can be a real issue. And sometimes there's not enough palliative care for people. And also in terms of hospice care. So that's another issue, is around hospice care and whether they get hospice care that they need. And do they understand death and loss and what that means? We call it disenfranchised grief. For example, there are situations where, say, a parent dies and they don't really explain, or they don't have the person go to the funeral, and that can be really tough for people. So it is important to train the staff. I know Roger Stancliffe just came out with a book about end-of-life issues. Next. We developed a curriculum called the Death and Dying curriculum, and it was about teaching about the concepts of death, some of the causes, end-of-life functions, the fact that everybody dies and that you don't return to life. I would like to say, though, that when we originally developed this, the person who did the first version of this was not very religious, was very much of a kind of an education person, and also just believed when you die, you die. And it was written kind of like that. And then I had someone working for me who was very spiritual and believed in an afterlife. And she said, you got to change this. And we changed it to be much more respectful about all different ways people view death and thinking about that. But the fact that in the practical day-to-day life, you will not see a certain person who dies. So that we tried to get that across. And then understanding grief and the emotional responses of it, that you have to let people grieve. And otherwise you're going to get some behavioral responses. Next. And then the whole thing about mourning and the fact that death happened, and that people do feel pain, and that they do have these losses, and then ways to deal with it. Some people like to see pictures go through old pictures and old, experiences, and then trying to do new things with their life, and turning to others for comfort. And then the various rituals of funerals and how people behave. And again, you have to account for people's religion, their culture, visitation, and how different it is if you go to different kinds of rituals, where in some religions it's more like this very, very sad thing, and for others it's like a celebration of their life. So it's different ways of thinking about it. Next slide. The whole issue of assisted suicide and disability. Last time I looked, it was allowed in 5 US states. It might be even more now. In some surveys, they found 51% of the US, they're pro for assisted suicide. Disability advocates generally don't like it, although I know some that do. Most are against it because they say that often people will think if you're disabled, you have a poor quality of life, and that somehow you're a burden on the family. And it's not, but sometimes it's because they don't really have the supports that they need. And they may not be really terminal. The Terry Schiavo case, when that happened, and this was a woman who, I don't know if they say she was brain dead, I guess, but not terminal, and whether they should withdraw the food or not. And there was a lot of debate about that. Next slide. So in this last part of my talk, I want to talk a little bit about bridging aging and disability, because it's important to do that as we do this future planning, because here you've got older caregivers, you got adults who are getting older, but we can learn from the aging field as well. And aging field can learn from the disability field. We have common needs, and we need efficiency of services. So I put up a picture here from Chicago of the Michigan Avenue Bridge when it goes up, but we want to get it put together. Next slide. And there's many challenges with that. And part of that is the historical segmentation of the service system. So they're 2 different systems, and sometimes they have different philosophies, terms, definitions. But what's happening is I'm seeing that aging is starting to really embrace person-centered planning. So they had something called options counseling, but which is different than person-centered planning. So they are starting to learn that. And they're also having some more understanding of what does it mean, self-determination. For example, somebody who develops dementia at the early stage, that we really need to think about what the person wants. As there was a film, I'm still Alice. I still have certain needs, certain ways I like things. But there's distinct fields of knowledge and practice. We can learn so much from aging, you know, for example, doing geriatric assessments, or how do you deal with dementia and family caregiving. So it's natural that people protect, and we don't want duplication of funds. Sometimes you'll have a different worker coming to the house for the parent and a different worker for the person with disability. So there's some missed opportunities that we have for knowledge translation, for policy change, for some co-funding. Well, we're starting to see some opportunities now. Next slide. So the administration of community living has developed, they do have bridging now. They have aging disability resource centers. I will say the D is pretty small in the resource centers. We have a National Respite Act that really is across aging and disability. The National Family Caregiver Support Program, which is part of aging, but technically they are supposed to be able to support older caregivers of people with of adults with IDD. The National Alzheimer's Project Act is including some IDD work, and chronic disease self-management has also included IDD. Next slide. In the national plan to address Alzheimer's disease, there's the National Task Group on ID and Dementia Practices. And if you get on their website, they have lots of material. And Matt Janicki has been on the NAPA. And more recently, I've been asked to be on one of the work groups for the Healthy Brain Initiative. So we're trying to bridge and trying to make them more aware of the needs of people with IDD and the families who care for them. Next. So they do a lot of workshops on dementia. I'm sure they've done them in Texas. I know they've done them in Texas. And they have an online support group for families and newsletters and a guide for families they developed out of a project they had in Rhode Island. Next slide. So looking to the future, you know, we certainly need to think about technology and universal design as we're doing the planning and where that can be used. You know, we're finding now that people can do Zoom. You know, we didn't think that people could do, people with IDD could get on the internet, or older families. And, you know, my sister with disabilities is on all the time, and my parents who are in their 90s. We need to think about transportation assistance. That's always a big issue. And we see as people get older, sometimes they can't drive anymore. One of my colleagues, her dad was almost 90 and he was still flying an airplane. That was kind of interesting. Pressure on the system and the families with the lack of workforce. We're hearing so much about that. And that's not just with direct support professionals, but even having people working at your local McDonald's, or you know, it's very hard to find enough people for the workforce. So that's been a big issue. The growing recognition of supportive decision-making and interdependence really can affect the way we think about future planning, and how families and other people and friends work together to help the person with disability in the future. And of course, we need research and better ways to bridge aging and intellectual and developmental disabilities. And thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. And I'm certainly willing to answer any questions that come up. And here's the contact information. Please feel free to contact us. I did want to mention that we have a project right now that we're working with the National Association of Councils on DD around future planning and family caregiving. And on bridging aging and disabilities, we just had a meeting. We selected the first 5 states that are part of that. And I don't think Texas is one of them, but maybe in the future, Texas might be interested in being part of this initiative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Heller. A lot of information covered in this session today, from healthcare to employment to lives of caregivers to access to barriers to overcoming them to different intervention programs that are existing. Resources were dropped. There was a lot of really helpful information, grief and loss. We covered a lot today, so thank you a lot, Dr. Heller, for that information. At this time, if you have any questions for the presenter, feel free to drop those in the chat box. I didn't see any pop up just yet. And then we'll take some time to take any questions. Any questions for Dr. Heller? Yes, you can unmute yourself as well. I just allowed that to be a function. I'll throw out a question as we wait for some questions to develop. Dr. Heller, you talked a lot about the health and well-being of the caregiver themselves as well as a few interventions and possibilities for them to make sure that they are taking care of themselves. As we are studying aging and IDD, we've looked a lot at the health of caregivers too. What is some advice that you would give to caregivers with making sure that they are also taking care of themselves as they are being able to provide the service and support for the self-advocate that they're taking care of?
Yeah. Taking care of themselves is very important. And their own health and their own health promotion. Often what happens for families is they neglect that when they're doing caregiving. And it's important to have friends and have a network and to make sure that the person with IDD is not only dependent on them. And often that's true, particularly for social reasons. So, like 90% we found would say that we're their sole social network. So, that's a lot of pressure on a family member. So really engaging with the family is going to really help, I think, with the help of the family caregiver.
Dr. Heller, there's a question in the chat. The question is any entity looking at the number of people ending up in jails due to inability to access services, which to include crisis services? And even more specifically, people being arrested from group homes, where are they receiving these services?
That's a good question about that. There's a lot of interest in that right now. We do a lot of training with the police and the sheriffs in the Chicago area because they don't know, especially like autism and some of those issues. I mean, I have a friend whose son with autism went around naked, exposing himself and got arrested. He really didn't need to be arrested. He needed training, education, etc. He wasn't trying to harm anybody or abuse somebody or whatever. So, that's an example. Another example is I know someone who's very well known in the field has a son with intellectual disabilities, and the son was mad at one of the staff in a group home, got frustrated, and then hit his fist on a car. The car happened to be a police car. And he dented a police car. He got arrested. They had to get lawyers and all that. So again, it's a matter of educating in terms of that. The statistics of how many people are in jail that have IDD, there probably is some data about that. I don't have it off the top of my head, but I know there's some data on disability and that there's a lot of people. Of course, if you include mental health, you're going to find very high. One of my students did a dissertation once on for teenagers, like reform school or, the jail system for teenagers, and over half had a disability that were in there. So yeah, that's a really big one. And we also have unfortunately, an institution in Illinois, a state-operated developmental center that has a whole forensics part to it, because nobody wants to take certain people to set fires and do things like that. It's a real challenge, people like that. They also develop what's called short-term stabilization homes, where some of the people who are very challenging in terms of aggressive behaviors and such behaviors that get them in criminal justice system, trying to work with them with intensive kinds of therapy and sort of contextual issues to deal with some of the reasons why they're doing that.
Thank you, Dr. Heller. All right, any more questions? As we wait for more questions, Cannon, you can go ahead and launch the closing slides. So before you all depart, please take some time to complete the evaluation link that has been dropped in the chat. This will also be sent via email along with the information about where you can access the recordings and handouts for this presentation today, along with the 2 others that were provided the weeks before. So if you could just take a few minutes to click on that evaluation link, it is very helpful for our group, AgriLife Extension, as well as TCDD, and then as well as Dr. Heller's group as well. So be sure to complete that. And you also get a certificate of completion by going through that evaluation link. We do have another question that just popped up from Dunn. Do nursing homes work effectively for an elderly adult caregiver / parent and a disabled person?
You mean if they can go in together? I would say that would be only true if they both needed that level of care. So it would not be good to have a person with intellectual disabilities in a nursing home if they don't need that level of care. And because they're not going to be well equipped to address their issues. There was a project in Illinois where there were 3,000 people with IDD basically dumped in nursing homes when some of the state-operated developmental centers or institutions closed, and they kind of dumped them there, think, oh, this is community living. And they didn't belong there. Only about 20% of those people really needed that kind of care. And 80% of them ended up moving out, and they did much better when they moved out into more community-based programs.
I think you made a good point earlier too, Dr. Heller, about we know that the life expectancy of adults with IDD is continuing to increase. The caregiver life expectancy is continuing to increase. So how do we prepare for both of those entities to be able to age and have somewhere to live that functions well? So definitely a lot of community-based programming that needs to continue to happen.
Yeah, and I think that's very much the message of this. That's why there's so much interest in this topic of engaging with aging and long-term planning.
All right. Still feel free to drop any questions. If you do need to contact Dr. Heller, her email is provided on the screen, and her email was also included in the handouts that were provided. And again, the recordings will be made available. And you can click on the link below to be able to, well, in the chat, to be able to access those recordings, and we'll try to get those uploaded sometime this week. And then of course, we'll send some follow-up emails about that. But thank you all so much for joining the conversation today and for being a part of this series this month. This, as Dr. Heller alluded to, a very important topic. It's not going anywhere because life expectancy is continuing to increase. So it's going to continue to be a widespread, important topic for us to address and think about and prepare for. But thank you so much, Dr. Heller, for providing the resources and information today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
All right. Thank you all. We'll hang out for a few more minutes for any more questions.